Akinwumi Adesina, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Christian.
So, you are, coming up to the end of your second term, and there's a lot on your plate, especially with this new American administration. You've said, first and foremost, that the onslaught of tariffs will send, quote, shock waves through African economies. Lay out the worst case scenario of what you fear might happen.
Well, first and foremost, I think, if you take a look at it, Christian, 47 out of the 54 African countries were actually affected by the tariffs, and that's a lot in Africa. And when you're looking at it, what that basically means is that the export revenue for many of these exports will fall. Clearly, export revenue will fall. Many of them will actually have a decline in their foreign reserves. Now, when that happens, the implication has to do with what happens with their domestic currencies. Now, those domestic currencies are suddenly going to weaken. When those currencies weaken, two things are going to happen. First, it's that you're going to find that most of these countries actually, Christian, they are import-dependent countries. So you're going to find that high inflation becomes a problem. And secondly, you find that the cost of actually servicing a lot of their debt, which is actually foreign currency debt, but in local currency, is going to get worse. And so this is exactly what you're finding as a situation. And so I feel that the other thing that we're going to see is the ODA, as you know, official development assistance, is going down. So if export to U.S. goes down, the export to China or Europe, all that goes down because they can actually buy also from you. That's going to affect official development assistance available. So I think the real issue that we must ask ourselves is, how does Africa navigate all of this?
I'm going to jump in there because I want to ask you exactly that. How does Africa navigate all of this? President Trump initially put, for instance, a whopping 50% tariff on Lesotho. And he said, in his words, that country was on one that nobody's ever heard of. So I'm just pointing that out. I would like your reaction to that. But it goes to the sort of scattershot method of these tariffs and this action. So how does a whole continent navigate?
It's certainly a challenge, but actually what you have to look at is, first, I have said that there's no point in African countries having a tariff war with the United States. They can afford to have one with the United States. But clearly there has to be some flexibility in the discussions and the negotiations that are going on in the interest of Africa. Check to your point that you raised. The total amount of trade, Christian, that Africa has with the United States is $34 billion. And that's not more than 1.2% of total U.S. trade with the rest of the world. It's nothing to really cry about. Even the whole issue we're talking about with regard to the trade surplus, Africa's trade surplus of the United States is only $7.2 billion. And so it's no more than 0.2% or so of the total amount of trade surplus. So what needs to be done is to have flexibilities in that discussion with the United States. We need more trade with the United States, not less trade. Lesotho, Madagascar, others need more trade, not less trade. Secondly, is to also look at, from the perspective of the African countries, they have to diversify their export markets to reduce this kind of impacts on their economies. And thirdly, as you know, we have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Now, that market is about a $3.4 trillion market, trade among ourselves. And so we're not actually trading more among ourselves, we're trading more with external parties than we are trading with ourselves. So expanding that domestic market is going to be a critical part of what Africa does. Now, a lot of interest now with what Africa has, cobalt, lithium, you name it. Africa has to use what it has to negotiate for a better trade and investment deal with all parts of the world. And so I think this is really very important. Lastly, Christian, just one more thing about this issue is that the population, take a look at the situation with China. Population matters. Your population is a problem only when you don't skill them, they don't have middle class, you don't have domestic savings, and that becomes a problem. I believe that Africa should skill up its population, boost its domestic savings, and be able to develop consumption as a bigger share of its GDP. That way you can tariff-proof yourself to some extent.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned China, and we posed the question because it's been posed with all these tariffs coming from the U.S. Will continents like Africa and other countries that are being hit by tariffs, will they turn to an alternative? You may want to be close to the United States, but if that's not possible, will you move to China? Some in the Trump orbit believe that that's just a myth and that's just a wave, to sort of get more aid, a threat to wave around. What is the reality? Because we know China is heavily embedded in Africa.
Well, I mean, just to be clear, I don't believe that Africa is going to be begging anyone for aid. I don't think aid is the way to develop anyway. I think, countries will have to develop a lot of other ways. But with regard to the issue of China and the United States, U.S. is a great ally of Africa. So is China. And so Africa is not going to suddenly isolate itself. It wants to build wider partnerships with the rest of the world. You have United States, you have China, you have EU, you have the Gulf countries, you have others. And so Africa is building bridges, not isolating itself. And that's the critical thing that Africa is doing. And so I think at the end of the day, we want to make sure that whatever deals are being done with Africa are transparent, are fair, are equitable, are actually led by Africa and in Africa's interest, and therefore make sure that Africa can capitalize and use what it has to negotiate a better deal for itself. But basically, Africa is not going to get into the game of isolating itself from any part of the world.
Mr. Adesina, let me ask you, because I wonder what you have come to the conclusion in your terms as a president of the bank. So here are the stats. Despite having almost 20% of global population, the 54 countries on the continent account for less than 3% of global GDP. Combined, it's smaller than Germany's alone. What is the answer to the enduring country, this rich continent in human and national resources? Why isn't it doing better? I mean, the question and the answer may be obvious, but people look at endemic corruption. They look at old leaders, clinging to power, a lack of rule of law, poor infrastructure. I mean, just to add, Mo Ibrahim, who gives an award every year, has not given it for many years, meant to honor a former African leader dedicated to democracy and human rights. What conclusion have you come to?
Well, first and foremost, I think, I always like data and data matters. Don't believe me to believe the data. The issue is you have today, Christian, 10 of the 20 fastest growing economies in the world being in Africa. And so African countries are doing well, despite a lot of the challenges they've had to face with, starting with COVID, starting with global geopolitical issues in Russia and Ukraine war, as you know, that led to increased inflation, for many of the countries, not on top of the debt overhang that they had because of weakening currencies and high interest rates in many parts of the world. And so Africa is actually quite a resilient continent. Look, I've been president, as you said, for the last 10 years at the African Development Bank. In our work, I started something called I5s, Light Up and Power Africa, Feed Africa, Industrialize Africa, Integrate Africa, and improve the quality of life of the people of Africa. Christian, in the last 10 years that we've been doing this, it's impacted on the lives of 565 million people. Take the case of electricity. Myself and Ajay Banga, president of the World Bank, launched a joint program, which is to Light Up Africa, to connect 300 million people in Africa to electricity, because without electricity, what can you do? You can't industrialize, you can't add value, you can't be competitive in the dark. And so that's the kind of thing that we are doing. So essentially what we are doing here, to your question about what Africans need to do to grow faster. First, Africa has to grow by domestic resource mobilization. In other words, expand the taxable base that you have. Make sure also that we are getting the right deals. Everybody's talking about all these critical minerals. Well, we got to make sure it's in the interest of Africa. You're paying the right taxes, you're paying the right royalties that allows the countries to build their fiscal space. The other one that are actually very important for many of the countries is to continue to accelerate investment in infrastructure. So, Christian, infrastructure is like a backbone that you and I have. If you have it, you can do a lot. If you don't have it, you can't do it. And we as a bank have invested more than $55 billion in infrastructure. So I would say, grow your domestic savings, invest a lot in infrastructure. Don't export raw materials, because export of raw materials for all of what we have is a highway to, it's the door to poverty. But when you export value added, you go on a highway to wealth. And so the key is industrialization, create jobs, and create value chains that Africa can be.
Because it it is extraordinary that you do export all those very valuable minerals to be processed outside, and African countries get only a pittance of what they're worth. But let me ask you, all of this that you're saying presumably is going to cost, as you say, money and investment. But many African countries have been very heavily impacted by the sudden cut in USAID, which means that, well, I just would like to hear from you how it's impacting lives and what it'll mean in terms of a government's ability to pay for these things that you're suggesting, while now it might have to also pay for this healthcare that maybe it didn't before.
Well, actually, just to be clear, the era of aid is gone, as we know it, completely gone. And I think the issue with aid is benevolence. But Christian, benevolence is not an asset class, right? People don't invest in that. The critical thing that we need to look at when it comes to the issue of aid is first and foremost to recognize that countries have to grow domestic resources. You don't grow by depending on others. You grow by expanding your domestic resources. So, for example, in the case of Africa, you want more taxes. And you want governments not only collect taxes, though, they have to deliver the value to the communities and the countries to a social contract. And secondly, you want to make sure that the whole issue of the discipline of investment, I want Africa to develop through the discipline of investment. Africa has so much. You've just talked about it. Look at renewable energy. God sunshine. God loves Africa so much. We've got so much of it. We've got hydropower. We have massive youth population that can become the labor force of the world. We have lots of land. Christian, 65% of the arable land left in the world to feed almost 9.5 billion people by 2050. It's in Africa. So what Africa does with it will determine the future of food in the world. So essentially what we've got to do is that now, how do we turn this into an opportunity for ourselves? First, I think that the issue of aid should be turned more into concessional financing. Why? Because concessional financing allows multilateral financial institutions like ourselves to do the following. First, we can mobilize private capital. Private capital is the engine of growth. We can help to develop projects. We can help to de-risk projects. We can help to also make sure that these projects, you have risk capital that you can provide for the private sector and blended finance that many of them can use. And so that is the way that I believe that we should go. And actually, Christian, at the end of the day, I think that Africa is the largest greenfield, open field in the world. Everything Africa has is challenge, whether it's energy, whether it's water, sanitation, whether it's health. It's an investor's dream. And so I want Africa to develop with pride, because there's no pride in begging from anybody. You develop based on your resources, and you have a hard-nosed way of actually doing that. So my issue is I want U.S. and Africa working a lot more together. I want to see investment partnerships between African countries a lot more with the United States, but on Africa's terms. Look, we are very strong. We have something, Christian, that I call the Africa Investment Forum, which we started about 8 years ago. It has mobilized over $225 billion of investment interest to Africa. We also have something called the Africa Development Fund, which is a concessional arm of the African Development Bank. Every dollar, Christian, leverages $10. And that's the way to put in money. That's the way to have sustainable impact.
Well, look, yours is a beautiful and a rich and a resource-filled country, and you sound like you have a lot of ideas and a lot of optimism, and it's good to hear. So as you leave soon your position, Akinwumi Adesina, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, Christian, and you do a good job.
Thank you.